All right, welcome out this week to A Case for America. I'm Austin Hepworth, and here along with co-host Michael Hepworth, we are looking forward today to talking about some COVID situations and using COVID as an example. We want to be clear in this one. We're not taking positions on, whether the different laws were right or wrong necessarily as it relates to COVID. We're trying to look at COVID from a bigger lens right now to understand more about America, how it works, and to understand more about some of our responsibilities even in government, in how the country operates, and in the systems of checks and balances. So last podcast, we were talking about looking at checks and balances in the government. We have shared before, and this is only available if you're watching this video, but for those that aren't watching the video, we have a seesaw essentially with a balance in the middle. And the middle we view as liberty, the state of being where laws have helped bring us out of anarchy, but laws aren't so egregious that they're approaching tyranny, where we're all governed by law. And we feel strongly America has attempted to strike this balance over the years. And the basis for a lot of what we talk about is that the closer society can be to this balance, to the place where there's enough laws to allow people to operate together, but there's not too many laws to stifle individual progression and freedom, that the world thrives, society thrives, people thrive. And so the systems of checks and balances is meant to try and help keep this here, because as the founders knew, when one person has too much power, that person can abuse it pretty quickly. And so during COVID, we're at a place where we're looking at a fascinating struggle that came up between federal government, state governments, local governments, between different branches of the government. And we wanted to go into a few examples of these to highlight, again, the checks and balance side of things, but also to highlight an issue that we feel is quite important, and that is the issue of experts. There's a big push in society right now to listen to the expert. People say, follow the experts. Health experts say to do this. Why are we even talking about it? Why is there any political debate? We see often this claim that, this shouldn't be a political issue. The experts have spoken. And that, to me, is a concerning trend, because experts, if you understand what an expert is, how they work, you'll understand that expert opinions and expert advice is both helpful and very much not helpful when you're trying to see a big picture to understand what's taking place. And ultimately, we feel that the place for politicians, for Americans, is to be their own expert, to make decisions after listening to those that have expert opinions, those that have expert advice, those that have relevant knowledge. But you need to listen to all of those that will be impacted by a decision to understand what decision is actually correct, to understand where that balance is struck. Because when things get out of balance, it really starts to impact a lot in society. So coming to COVID, most, unless you're a very young child, you likely remember COVID pretty well. It started, at least I recall hearing reports out of China, and China locking things down and thinking, wow, that's crazy. Never experienced a lockdown. Can't imagine that here. Just kind of blew it off and didn't think too much about it. Fast forward just a little while, and suddenly there's a report that I think it was Washington or something was shutting things down. And I just went, wait, what's going on? This is kind of crazy. And then suddenly I'm in Utah and they're announcing similar things. And it seemed to be a fear that swept over America pretty quickly. And we're ordered to stop doing things, stop doing businesses, large events, large gatherings. And again, during this time, one of the important things to know is that not all shutdowns were mandated by law. There were many voluntary ones. Many churches voluntarily chose to stop holding worship services. They weren't required to by law, but they chose to as part of their own operations. But I remember in Utah, parks were even closed, public parks. And I remember someone talking about a mother and father. They brought their young children to a park during the lockdowns. And someone called on them, and the fire department came out as the police at that point, and told the people they had to leave because the park was closed. And so we hit this place in America where the health experts, when consulted, said, well, the best way to stop a virus from spreading is to stop contact. Just don't let people interact with each other. It's the best way to stop or slow a virus. And part of it, there were some people, I think, that believed they could actually potentially stop the virus. There were others that believed they were buying time to get a vaccination together. And again, we're not going to go into, we know there's a lot of feelings and opinions on whether about the vaccination, about different things on both sides. We're very respectful of both of those. But we're looking at the bigger picture of government, society, the checks and balances that were there. So with this, consider for a minute, if the health experts are there telling the government officials, hey, the best way to stop this is to shut things down. I like to think, well, let's say that they listen to that expert, and that's probably true. The best defense we had at the time against COVID was to probably not have people have contact with each other. But if you're there then saying, okay, so what if I shut everything down? What happens? And what would be the result if we then brought in a business expert and said, what happens if we shut everything down? And you think about that, what the business expert would have said. And they probably would have talked about the damage to businesses, the different things that take place. My bet is that the government listened to some of that because we had a lot of bailouts coming suddenly. There were PPP loans. There were, now we have the employee retention credit. We have a bunch of things where they're trying to help businesses recover from being shut down. We do know, though, that many small businesses failed during this time. These are individuals that had put a lot of heart and soul into things, and those failed. And then if you would have asked, okay, well, if we're going to pump a lot of money into business, what would the impact be? You could ask an economist, and probably many of them, probably not all of them, because experts disagree on things, would have talked about, well, if we're just throwing money at things and it's money that's borrowed, deficit spending type money, it's going to cause inflation. Because it's pretty standard that if the government gives money to everybody and it's money that's just borrowed, there's no value created for it, nothing done for it, that cheapens the value of the other money in existence and causes inflation. And so looking back at COVID, we can see some of these things happening. But it's interesting to look at some of the unintended consequences of COVID and to look at even maybe what experts didn't fully predict, maybe what some did, but they weren't considered expert enough. And to look at some of these pieces. And Michael, I don't know if you have any thoughts or examples of different scenarios that have played out with COVID and maybe some of the consequences maybe that were anticipated or not anticipated.
Yeah, we can kind of go over some numbers, some different ideas, and we can maybe start with schools. That was kind of what kicked off closures in America. I think it was the North Shore School District in Washington State was the first to announce it's just closing everything and going to shift to online learning. And then that was March 4th of 2020. And within 3 weeks, every public school in the United States had been closed. 50 million students had been sent home. Half of them wouldn't go back to their schools for more than a year. And that response was kind of unprecedented in the world. No other high-income country in the world relied on remote instruction to the extent that America did. We never saw anything like this either in the Great Depression or through the two world wars that had as dramatic an impact on education. So this is a pretty huge decision all across America for schools to say we're shutting down, we're going to online learning. And there was some initial criticism of that. Some people had some ideas of what could possibly be the outcome of that. But as we're getting, into 3 years outside of that decision, we are seeing a lot of those effects. We are seeing rates of childhood anxiety and depression increasing. They were actually decreasing leading up into 2020 and just suddenly spike and not come back down in these 3 years, particularly among young girls. We've seen skills that are gained during the early years of school, early reading skills, early math skills take a significant drop. Young children don't have the same skills they typically do. There was some studies done. I guess there was a point in time in Kuwait when they shut down schools during the Gulf War, and they analyzed the effect that had on those children throughout the rest of their lives. We're far enough out from that time. They can look at what happened to those children throughout the rest of their lives. And they were estimating income loss over their entire life and how they were earning less than someone who didn't miss school for 6 months or a year. And their earnings per year were, thousands, $10,000 less. They were saying was correlated to missing that early time in school. So we're not just talking about temporary impacts to students now, that when we started sending children back to school, there was really no plan to, hey, how do we make up for what they missed? In fact, lots of schools have maintained days where they just do online school. They will leave children home for a day and say, hey, it's an online day. And they've kind of incorporated that into their policy. Instead of saying, let's get back to what we're used to do, they say, let's try to keep this hybrid model going forward. And so they're seeing some really devastating effects as far as educational levels among students, as far as anxiety levels, as far as depression. If you want to get into more societal impacts, there's been spikes in suicides. There's been spikes in alcohol and drug-related deaths that began with shutdowns. There's been spikes of depression and anxiety in the culture as a whole in society. And so there are consequences to just telling everybody to stay home and not go to work, not go to school, not do certain things. And I don't know that we know the full extent of those. They're still trying to analyze it. These are issues that can take years, decades to fully understand the impact of. And so, we'll probably get more and more insight into the consequences of those decisions as we go down the road. For example, the one article talking about school disruptions across the world said that the results of the education decisions today, whether made by policymakers or families, are by their nature properly measurable only after a long time, at which point often very little can be done to correct past mistakes. In other words, one needs to be either very patient or have an ingenious research design to measure the impact. And so it's just hard to tell immediately what damage, if any, has been done. Early indicators are some pretty serious damage to educational abilities and social functioning. You can look at the impacts of the decisions to the economy. These are pretty debated impacts. It's hard to research just kind of economic impact of decisions of shutdowns and different things without getting into a sea of this was needed to be done, this should have been done, this was the right decision, this was the wrong decision. There's not a lot of just kind of analyzing the data as it sits. We do know things like in the second quarter of 2020, GDP in America saw a drop of 9.1%. Since they started tracking GDP in 1947, there's never been a drop greater than 3%. So this was 3 times as large as the largest drop that had ever been seen. That's pretty significant. COVID-19 related job losses in the beginning of 2020. Since 2009, the economy had been steadily growing. That we had the recession in 2008, and then we started a recovery, and it had been growing consistently up through 2020. And COVID-19 job losses wiped out 113 straight months of job growth. There have been 113 straight months of job growth. COVID-19 wiped it out just in a matter of months. The fact that people were shutting down, sending people home, closing down. Employment fell by 20.5 million jobs in April of 2020. In December 2019, women held more non-farm payroll jobs than men for the first time during a period of job growth. But by May of 2020, that had reversed back. There was massive losses in leisure and hospitality, which hire 53% women, and they mostly all just lost their jobs. At the beginning of the pandemic, 120,000 businesses temporarily closed. Many of those ended up being permanent. And then 30 million US workers were unemployed. And long-term effects, again, highly debated as the economy started opening up again and people started getting jobs back. There's lots of debates about what we're seeing today. Is it a cause of COVID? Is it a cause of other things? There's so many factors in economic decisions that people don't like to pin it on one thing or another, unless they're trying to make a point. But today we still see impacts of shortages. Some people attribute those to COVID-19, some people don't. Today we have 2 million fewer Americans participating in the labor force compared to February of 2020. And so this is labor force participation rate. This isn't those seeking for jobs. This is kind of an interesting statistic to look at. And it kind of goes back to your note about the experts. It's not that the experts are wrong, but they're looking at something specific, and they're going to give you detailed information about that specific thing. And so if you look at, people like to use the unemployment rate in America as a measure of how well the economy is doing. They like to look at how many jobs are being created each month. And that's usually a healthy sign. Hey, we had 200,000 some odd jobs created. The economy is looking really healthy. Well, in America today, there are 9.8 million job openings, but there are only 5.9 million unemployed workers, 5.9 individuals who are actively looking for work. So if we gave every unemployed worker a job, if they matched up, we would still have almost 4 million jobs unfulfilled, just left open. And while that's a better problem than the reverse, more people looking for work than jobs available, that still causes something called a labor shortage. It means there's more work to be done than we have workers to do it. That job gap is actually even bigger than that because of skill gaps, but that's another story. So there's a labor shortage today, meaning there's more work to be done than people to do it, which means labor shortages cause production shortages. And so that means that there are more people pursuing goods than there are goods being produced. And that causes inflation. That's the definition of inflation, is more money chasing fewer goods. And so that gap is just widened. It wasn't nearly as big pre-pandemic, and now it's really, really big, and it's just continuing to get bigger, it seems. And so it's an interesting way to look at the economic health. You'll hear things like the economy's doing really well, we're creating a lot of jobs, but if there's no one to fulfill those jobs, then there's just a labor shortage, and that can just put increased pressure on inflation. There's if you remember, costs went up considerably at the very beginning of the pandemic on almost everything. I was purchasing wood right before the pandemic started. You get it like $2.50 a 8-foot 2x4, and then at its height, you could pay upwards of $9 for an 8-foot 2x4. A lot of that had to do with shipping costs. As the pandemic started, you either didn't want to travel, people made a lot of decisions not to travel, or you couldn't. Airlines were shutting a lot of routes down. You couldn't go stay at hotels. All kinds of those things were happening. So individuals were shifting a lot of their discretionary income from travel to just purchasing big ticket items. And it caused a huge pressure on the shipping market. They were trying to get more things shipped while losing the ability to keep workers. Workers were either leaving or they couldn't employ as many people because they couldn't keep people as close together, or they were just getting shut down. So the shipping lines had increased pressure on them to ship more things because people were purchasing more things at least initially. And so that caused a huge issue for inflation. There's less goods available because we couldn't move them, but people had more discretionary income. They were trying to buy them. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was actually a large increase in savings in American bank accounts. There were lots of people that lost their jobs, but the federal government spending almost $1 trillion of cash directly to Americans was paid to a lot of people that never lost their jobs, and it was just extra money for them. And most of them just spent it on kind of big ticket items. So there's really high pressure to get more products at a time when they were harder to get. It was harder to ship. It was harder to produce. People had shut down. You couldn't get raw materials. And so, again, more pressure for inflation, more money chasing fewer goods, kind of a perfect storm of an economic problem at that point. That's just a few of the things, some of the consequences, I guess, of some of the policies that were pursued, or and in some cases, just choices that were made by individuals to follow most of it was done by trying to follow the advice of the medical experts is usually what was discussed. We want to slow down the spread or stop the spread, whatever they're searching for. And, that's kind of the direction they took.
Yeah, no, those are all real interesting examples to look at of some of the things that took place. I know, talking about the money that was sent, additional income being there for people that weren't unemployed. It seemed that one of the things that happened is the government wanted people to spend it to keep the economy up. They knew that money still had to change hands in the economy, so they were hoping people would buy things. I know Japan tried the same thing. They sent money to everyone, and they were very disappointed because most of the Japanese paid down debt with it, and that wasn't facilitating business to keep their economy functioning. But the Japanese weren't as spendy as the Americans, and so the money, the stimulus money that went, didn't stimulate the economy necessarily. But it's even interesting to look at the stimulus money. There's two companies to look at right now that I think are interesting. They're smaller examples, but you see companies like Purple Mattresses. They went gangbusters during COVID. They just had so many orders come in when this money came out. People have it on their list. Oh, Purple Mattress would be nice. They're more expensive. And they couldn't keep up with demand. They were way backlogged. And now they have, a serious reduction in orders. They're still trying to keep things afloat, but it's a very different outlook of the company right now. Another company is Instapot, that they came out a little bit, I don't know how long before COVID. I only saw them probably a little bit before COVID. But during COVID, they just took off, tons of sales, everyone buying their Instapots. And now everyone potentially that needed one, I guess, has one. I don't know what the story is. But they suddenly went through this artificial kind of spike in demand. I mean, I guess it was a real spike in demand, but a little artificially created through law and policy. And they then now aren't doing anything. And they are, I think, seeking bankruptcy protection or very close to that because of these issues.
And that's a really good point, that they talk about stimulating the economy. And to some extent, if people are willing, as we pointed out, they will go out and spend the money. But this isn't any kind of long-term strategy. There are consequences to every decision. You can't just hand more money to the people and then say, look at our economy, it's growing like crazy. You're not creating wealth that way. That's how economies grow, is by the creation of wealth, which comes from labor. All you're doing is kind of pushing problems further down the road. If you go crazy right now with everybody buying everything, then it's more money chasing fewer goods, because you have a labor shortage. If labor's going to try to rise to meet the demand, but if it can't rise to meet demand, then you just have more money chasing fewer goods, which is just inflation. And in the end, the extra money that they gave you isn't worth anything anymore because of inflation. And so there's this really tricky balance, and there's a lot of policies about it. We don't need to get into right or wrong of it, but where the federal government via the Fed, via the Treasury, they try to manage inflation. I guess to look at it in the way they're looking at it, so that they can keep the economy going, but not get it so high that your money becomes worthless, and not get it so low that there's no growth. There's all these policies that play at that, and sometimes we think that we can just dump money and we'll stimulate and things will be great. And we have to remember that there are consequences to these decisions, inflation being one of them.
Yeah, and I think that some of it, to your point, is just kicking the can down the road for some of these companies that may have failed during COVID. We artificially spiked their demand, and now they're still struggling. And so we still see suddenly, we have these real interesting occurrences still happening. We don't fully know how all this plays out yet, but tech sector is seeing huge layoffs. Some of these big companies just lay off thousands to thousands upon thousands of workers. And we had two incredibly large banks fail. Two of the largest bank failures in US history happened this year. And you start looking at these pieces and you go, these are troubling signs. They're just random things popping up here, random things popping up there. Again, is it related to COVID? Is it not? People will disagree. The experts will disagree. They'll look at all these things. But I say, personally, how could COVID not have contributed? Maybe it's not the sole cause, maybe there's other factors, but COVID touched everything. And I don't know how it couldn't have impacted it, because we had such sweeping changes, so many things done that we've never done here before in America. And now we're starting to see some of these interesting things. Another thing that was interesting, and this one will actually be really interesting to see how it plays out over the years. We probably won't have a real grasp of this till 2030 when we do another census. But Americans migrated like crazy across the country. I think there's been an incredible shift in political boundaries, cultural boundaries, groups, all kinds of things, where it changed real estate markets, it changed demand, it did a lot. There's also, of course, Airbnb during this time, where everyone wants to buy Airbnb rental. Companies are scooping up properties. And so again, COVID's not the only thing affecting real estate, but there is this fascinating shift where people say, oh, I can work from home now. There's way more latitude to do that. So many jobs, people start going different places, leaving some of the more expensive places, going to cheaper places. And the 2020 census came too early to really capture most of that migration and what took place. But I think it'll be very interesting in 2030 to see some of those impacts. And some of those may have happened anyways over time as technology came in. But it certainly, COVID and the policies helped spur a very quick change, where it was the companies had to embrace online meetings if they were going to stay operational. And so many of them did. And then that caused a big shift. That also has caused, I think, it's been interesting to look at the workforce. There's still places where people resist going back to the office. We still have, to your point, this 2 million additional people that just said, I don't need to work. If you read some of the articles, the millennial male is really disappearing from the workforce. Something's happening to them. I don't think we've even started to study the impacts on the adults, really, from what happened with COVID. We've looked at children quite a bit. We're seeing that. We're recognizing that schools, grades, all kinds of things are falling behind, but we haven't really started to scratch the surface on millennials and what took place. Older generation. I remember as an attorney, I was asked to go do a will and trust for a couple who were in a care center. And it was heartbreaking. I was allowed in the care center because I was considered essential as an attorney. For whatever reason, attorney services were listed as essential, but their family members couldn't come in with them and they couldn't come visit. And we had a lot of old people die in loneliness, sadness. Funerals during the time were limited to only 10 adults, or 10 people, I shouldn't say adults, 10 people in a number of places. And it was very concerning to see some of these impacts that may never be measured. How do you measure the impact of not being able to attend your grandpa's funeral? I don't know. I don't know how to do that for people. And what that does, we see obviously one of the interesting things I don't think we talk a lot about with COVID too is we know that there's a lot more frustration in society, a lot more conflict with each other. We're going, why is everyone so upset on planes? Why are they doing all these things? But if you think about some of that, the impact of some of those things of, well, you can't go to a funeral, you can't go to a wedding, you can't do these different pieces, you potentially start to develop hatred or anger. It grows over time. Other things feed it, obviously. Masks, airlines, all those things. There's a lot of tension in those places when people are close together. And the policies really, again, COVID obviously contributed to fear, tension, those things. And then this dispute over policies. But when people feel forced to do something they don't want to do, it creates internal hatred and anger as well. And I think that's something we're still grappling with as a society.
Yeah, a lot of these decisions were really personal, and I don't think we talk about that as much either. And I think a lot of policies can be personal, but I think a lot of these ones felt very personal. You felt the impact of it every day in your life and everything that you did, and that probably contributes a lot to what people were feeling and can contribute to, you know, dissatisfaction, anger, whatever the case is. Sometimes when a law is created or enacted, you're touched by it once. Maybe you see it on the news, somebody else is impacted by it. There are a lot of laws out there, but for the most part, they don't touch our lives too much. All of these decisions were very personal, and I don't think we can dismiss the impact of when you're down to legislating what people are doing every single day of their lives. There's going to be societal impacts to that.
Yeah, and that gets to the point of, on the balance, to say when laws are telling us everything we do individually, telling us whether you're essential or not, going into some of these things, it starts to create this real rub and this real conflict. And Americans, I don't believe, are accustomed to being told everything they should do or shouldn't do with the law. And I think there was a lot of conflict and rub that came in. And this is a good segue into the checks and balances to say, okay, we're looking at a government scenario and to start to look at what actually happened. Now, it's fascinating if you talk to people and ask them. I feel that most people I know were dissatisfied with the government response during COVID. Now, that means that some were very upset the government didn't do more, and some were very upset the government did as much as it did. But I know of very few people that go, I think the government got it right. Now, one of the reasons for that is because there were an incredible diverse approach to how things took place across America. Part of the checks and balances is that actually the federal government didn't do an incredible amount of legislation in this. They were pushed to quite often. That was one area where people were upset that they didn't set a national standard for things. But the CDC it's a national federal type agency, but it doesn't have the power to make laws. And so the CDC would come out and put out health advice, say, oh, we should shut things down, airlines shouldn't fly, they'd issue these different things. And I think what the issue is that airlines, if the CDC came out and said, oh, we shouldn't do this, or they said, oh, you should sanitize, and all the businesses started sanitizing. I think the fear for everybody was that they'd be sued if they didn't do what the CDC said. So we were in this interesting scenario in America where CDC doesn't have official power to legislate, but because the expert comes out and says something, and the attorneys love to jump on things and say, "Oh, you didn't do what the expert said. You're negligent." Tons of businesses were terrified of lawsuits. And so, but what happened in that scenario is that when a church would shut down, but the law didn't tell them to, it's hard to argue that it's hard for them to go in and say my constitutional rights were violated for shutting me down. When a business shut down, but there was no direct law telling them they had to, it was hard for them to have any kind of check or balance on that. And so it was interesting to see how much fear drove decision making during this time. And like you say, it was a school district first in Washington that shut down. Within 3 weeks, all the school districts across America had shut down. Some of those were local level decisions where the school district itself decided to close. Others were maybe state level where the state said, oh, we're closing. But in general, I think everyone was afraid. And even at that time, to my knowledge, we didn't have a lot of fear for the safety of most children with it. COVID wasn't really impacting kids. And yet we still shut it down. Now, granted, there were teachers, there were others as well. But we had this funny play in America in the checks and balance system where there weren't even a lot of laws at the beginning. There was a lot of fear. And you can't necessarily say, well, who's in charge of checking fear? You know, what group or whatever is in charge of these different things. And so some of it was fear of attorneys, fear of law, which means fear of courts. So perhaps the judicial side has grown a little too much to legislate a lot of that. But going into that, courts did look at some COVID scenarios, and certainly want to share a few of those with you. I always think cases are interesting. So if you're viewing video, you can see on the screen here, there was a case filed, let's see which case it was, On Fire Christian Center versus Greg Fisher. And this was in Kentucky. So Greg Fisher was the mayor of Louisville. And so they also sued the city of Louisville. So April 11th, this was issued April 11th, 2020. Easter Sunday was April 12th, 2020. And what happened was that Louisville said, hey, nobody can go to church. We've got COVID. So the city actually stepped in. Again, this is the city. This isn't the state. This isn't the federal government. This is a city telling people in a city, you cannot go to church services for Easter. So the judge at the time, this is how this judge responded. I don't think you would have gotten this response out of all judges by any stretch of the imagination. But this judge said, on Holy Thursday, an American mayor criminalized the communal celebration of Easter. That sentence is one that this court never expected to see outside the pages of a dystopian novel, or perhaps the pages of The Onion. But 2 days ago, citing the need for social distancing during the current pandemic, Louisville Mayor Greg Fisher ordered Christians not to attend Sunday services, even if they remained in their cars to worship, and even though it's Easter. The mayor's decision is stunning, and it is beyond all reason unconstitutional. So this judge is very opposed to what took place here. If you read the decision, at the time in Louisville, alcohol stores were still allowed to be open, and you could go buy alcohol, but you couldn't go to church. And so part of what took place is, as the courts looked at this, they said, is the legislature, are these mayors, are these groups starting to make rational decisions? Are they looking at, are they targeting protected classes? Religion's a protected class. And you need to treat your religion equally with other groups. So if you can go to the store and buy alcohol, why can't you go to church? And that's one of their questions. And I think it's a fair question to ask. But in this case, the judge was very perplexed because the On Fire Christian Center had offered to do drive-in church services. They were going to be outside. Every car was going to be parked 6 feet from each other, and they were going to hold church in their cars 6 feet away. and that was still criminalized. And so the judge had very little trouble striking that down and saying, no, we're not going to go there. And that was a check and balance, a city doing something that then the people injured by that, the church appealed to the federal government in federal court to say, hey, help us out. We need a check and balance on this city. And the federal government did that and put that check in place and allowed people to go to church. Now, it will allow them to go to a drive-in church. Now, people may disagree with that. They may say, well, they shouldn't have gone. People may say, well, they should have shut down the alcohol centers too. But it's interesting to think, as a government official, you're there if you're shutting things down and you think, ooh, what happens if I shut down access to alcohol? We just told everyone to stay at home. They don't have anything to do. And now I tell them they can't have alcohol. At some point, that things are going to probably break. People are just going to stop obeying you. And that was probably part of what drove that legislative decision, was just sheer understanding of humans and what would really take place if they went that far with things. But I look at that as interesting because we like to, say the CDC is to blame, federal government's to blame. That's a common thing. But this was a pervasive, the same thing was happening over and over and over again across thousands of cities, thousands of counties, thousands of school districts, each making their own decisions. And again, a lot of it was fear-based, but it was also, I'd say, not just fear, but people genuinely wanted to do the right thing. I don't think any government official wanted to have someone say to them, you killed so-and-so. Your fault, this happened, your fault, this happened. And so you put that together, you put together a chart, a path where we haven't gone down that road before, and it becomes real easy to say, well, we're going to follow the CDC here because they're the health experts. They can tell us pretty concretely we should do this. But it goes back to what I view as the need for politicians, the need for the balance in America, is that you should try and take in competing views, competing ideas, start to understand what may impact things. Again, at the time, that was difficult because we couldn't fully predict all of what would take place. The experts hadn't seen all of it before. And we do have to understand that there's always this element of faith to every decision we make, that no expert can predict everything. And we're still operating on faith because a ton of what we experience in life is still wait and see. Let's wait and see what happens.
And I think that's an important point. You mentioned that sometimes we talked about fear at the beginning, kind of moving a lot of this, and the politicians are working out of fear as well. Like you said, they don't want to be responsible for, hey, you killed so-and-so. Your policies led to the deaths of this many people. I've seen these numbers are out there already. When people are critical of politicians, their method of handling the pandemic, they will say, you caused this many excess deaths. And I think there is a responsibility. We talk about checks and balances. One of those checks is the people. The people are supposed to check the government. And if we just shove every bad thing that happens onto the government and make it their responsibility, then you will just get policies that are made out of fear, right? If the politician doesn't want to look bad, then he's going to try to do whatever the people are shoving onto him. He's going to try to make them happy. And there's some good to that. But then there's the bad of, if we say every bad thing that happens is the politician's fault, then they're going to make a lot of really poor decisions. There has to be a point in time where us people accept responsibility for certain things that we do. We can talk about where that line is drawn, but I don't know today that there's ever a discussion of what responsibility do people have outside of the law in regards to, call it COVID, call it any kind of policy. What responsibility do we have that we can take on that will make the burden of governing easier and keep us at the fulcrum of that teeter-totter we're talking about? If we ask the government to do everything, we're asking for tyranny. There has to be a point where we don't ask them to do everything for us. It's part of the check that the people provide.
Yeah, that's a great point, the personal responsibility side, because if we don't take personal responsibility and if we blame the government for everything bad that takes place. I often look at it, and every time that there's an economic downturn, people instantly blame the president. I just go, do you know how many factors are at play in this? You can't just pin blame on one person. And again, maybe there's something that one person can do to kill the economy, but the American economy is pretty resilient. It survived a lot of presidents. And it's one where half of America says, oh, this one's good and this one's bad. It's always a switch. But in the end, America survived an amazing number of presidents, mayors, governors, all these things. And a lot of that comes because people choose to be responsible still. But it is concerning to see discussions whenever something bad happens, there's a bad news report. One of the first comments seems to be, why isn't there a law? Why isn't there a law? How dare there not be a law? We need more of this, or we need more of that. Oh, someone was defrauded. Why isn't there another law? And you think about it, you think, can the law stop fraud? Can the law truly stop somebody from lying to another person? Is there any way, does the law even remotely have the ability to stop a person from lying to someone else? And what are we really asking for when we say, oh, someone was defrauded, the law should have done more? So the law should have been forcing a verification of every transaction before it took place. Imagine what that would do to the economy. Imagine what that would do to your life. If it's, oh, you'll do this for me, you're trying to hire a plumber, well, let's go through the government system that can check it, verify it, predict the future, and say, oh, yep, this plumber is going to deliver. These things just don't happen. There's no way for the law to address all these things. And that's part of this balance that we like to look at, is to say, what can the law do? What is the law's role? Can the law stop someone from dying from COVID? And I think one of the things we saw in America is the law is completely powerless to stop people from dying from a disease. Now, did it save some people? Maybe. Maybe not. That's debated. But people still died the world over. And the law couldn't stop that. All the force in the world couldn't stop a virus. The virus didn't care what the law said. People as social creatures needed interaction. We needed food. We needed all these different pieces. People still needed ACs fixed. They needed a bunch of things during this time. They needed family. And you can't just take those away from people and expect them to be okay. And so the law, in a situation where it can't stop these things from happening, can't stop people from dying from a disease, we then look at what its role is. And so in this struggle back and forth, another case that's interesting came out of California. And I'll just share a little synopsis of this here. This is one, this case is called, that's actually a long one, it was July 23rd, 2021. A number of parents, Matthew Brock, or Broch, don't know how to say that, and others brought this case against Gavin Newsom, governor of California, others in the California school district. And there were two sets of parents in this case. There were parents who had children in public school, and there were children who had, or there were parents who had children in private schools. And they both brought claims saying that the government didn't have the authority to shut down schools. They were saying that they had a federal constitutional right to education, and that the state couldn't take that away from them by excluding them from being in person. California said all education has to be basically online. Kids can't get together during this time. So the courts looked at that and they said, as it relates to public education, the state can do whatever it wants. The state's in charge of public education. There's no federal constitutional right to provide education in any particular manner, and we're not going to go there. And they were pretty dismissive of that. They say, though, this is a quote from the case, we reach a different conclusion, however, as to the state's interference in the in-person provision of private education to the children of 5 of the plaintiffs in this case. California's forced closure of their private schools implicates a right that has long been considered fundamental under the applicable case law. the right of parents to control their children's education and to choose their children's educational forum. Because California's ban on in-person schooling abridges a fundamental liberty of these 5 plaintiffs that is protected by the Due Process Clause, that prohibition can only be upheld only if it withstands strict scrutiny. And so the court goes on to say that it was not narrowly tailored. That's one of the constitutional things. We'll get into some of these things later, talking about what some of these things mean. But they said the way it was written, the way it was applied, the state of California didn't have a constitutional right with the way they wrote things to ban in-person schooling for private schooling, because they said parents had a right to choose their children's educational forum and to control their children's education. So this was one where the courts were balancing the needs of the community versus the needs and rights of individuals. And so on our balance scale, you could think about how this state, you could think about individual at one end and community at the other end, to say, then they're trying to strike this balance to say, yep, a lot of the COVID laws are related to protecting the community, but the community doesn't even have the right to take away this fundamental interest of parents to control the education of their children. Now, again, this was a federal court correcting state action at this time. This was California state policy that came out. And the federal government stepped in to say, it's too far. You're taking away too many rights in this. Can't do that. So these are a few examples of courts stepping in. Another example, I guess, is the U.S. Supreme Court did take up a COVID case when President Biden mandated that businesses of over 100 employees have all their employees vaccinated. And so this was a interesting debate. There was that one, and then there was the one that came down from the federal government that said all hospitals have to vaccinate all their workers. And in the end, the Supreme Court said the federal government had the ability to mandate hospitals have their workers be vaccinated. And that was because the federal government gave hospitals Medicare and Medicaid funds. They paid them for services. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, the federal government can put conditions on receipt of those funds. Like essentially it was, if you want Medicaid or Medicare, you have to vaccinate all your people. And one of the reasons that was allowed is because the Supreme Court says, well, if a hospital's really opposed to that, they can self-select out of Medicare and Medicaid. In theory, that's true, but in practice, most hospitals would go bankrupt if they stopped taking Medicare and Medicaid patients. They wouldn't be able to adjust to that seismic of a shift. And so self-preservation of the organization said, well, we have to now vaccinate everybody. When it came to the businesses, though, the Supreme Court held the federal government did not have the ability under just Biden alone to mandate that, and they struck down that provision. And so those were executive actions. And one of the important things to understand is that in general, the executive branch doesn't make law. That's supposed to be the legislative branch that does that. And that puts us in a scenario where we look at balances between the legislative and executive branches. And so we have the legislative branches that, interestingly, and this is probably part of the fear of legislative representatives not knowing fully what to do during this time. Many of them were content letting the executive branch, the governor, the mayor, whoever, issue orders. Now, the basis for this is that in the past, legislative branches had passed emergency acts that said, oh, when there's a state of emergency, the governor, or the mayor, whoever can step in and control things. In Utah, if a state of emergency was declared, the governor had the ability to control things for 30 days. And that was tested. Those boundaries were tested and pushed. The governor said, oh, state of emergency, take control for 30 days. 30 days comes up, he declares another state of emergency and continues for another 30 days and another 30 days and another 30 days. In Utah, the legislative branch looked at that, they passed laws, and they said, whoa, you're abusing things at this point. And they actually passed a law to clarify that a state of emergency can't be declared from the same ongoing situation. It was a limit of 30 days. I asked during this time, one of the legislative reps, I said, why are we giving power to the governor at all in this scenario? Because this original bill was passed back in the 1950s when the legislature couldn't all meet together. Utah has a part-time legislature. They're not in session all the time. And if there is a state of emergency, a bomb goes off or a big earthquake or something, then the legislature in theory couldn't all get together in the 1950s to decide what to do. And so they said, when there's this emergency, we'll let the governor do things for 30 days, giving us time to kind of get back together, regroup, and do things. But I said, but during COVID, what happened was you guys instantly switched to meeting online. And the legislature started voting online. And they could do it from their homes, they could do it from wherever. And I said, isn't there something that we should talk about here, that maybe the governor only needs emergency power if the legislature can't meet? And that one went largely, I think, just kind of ignored, where it was just kind of swept under the rug and caught up in the bigger arguments of the day. But I look at that, and so legislatively, the governor can declare states of emergency. Some of that's been curtailed a little in some states. It can't happen in all states because sometimes the governor will veto that legislation. And then you need, depending on the state, a certain percent of the legislature to override that veto. And in states where it's close to 50-50 split, Republican, Democrat, they have a hard time overriding those vetoes of the governor. So not all state legislatures have been able to check the executive. Utah did with COVID response, where they took away some of those powers a little bit. But interestingly, they weren't very aggressive about pursuing a lot of the governor's policies, even though they were more unpopular. And I think part of that stemmed back to they had the fear. They didn't want to take responsibility and be blamed for something. It was easy for them to kind of point fingers and say, oh, look what the governor did. Oh, he did it. What do I do? And then they'd tell people, oh, you need to go file a case in court. People would go file a case. And then Utah, the governor would switch the basis, the law he was relying on, or the state of emergency or whatever. It'd kind of make the original case moot. They'd have to rewrite the whole thing. And there were too many iterations of that for citizens to keep up with, for their attorneys to keep up with. And most of those cases just dropped out. And if you asked most states why they were doing things during this time, they'd point to the CDC and said, well, because the CDC said so. And the CDC would say, hey, we're not the policymakers. We're just telling you what to do with health. And there were a lot of finger pointing back and forth. But I do think that highlights some of where we're at in America, where when something goes wrong, very few people like to say, that's me. We're getting very well versed in passing the buck to somebody else. And I think, Mike, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. That's a really good point about the abdication of responsibility, in that it's so legislatures just like to say, well, it's the governor, and if you like it or not, if you like it, well, yeah, we like that governor. If you don't like it, well, then take it up with him. But it's really irresponsible of a policymaker to just say, this is what the expert said, so we're going to do it. Because why is the policymaker in office at that point? If we're going to have the experts, I don't even know what that means, decide our policies for us, they should just be running the government if it's that simple. And the point of the policymaker is to say, there are a number of competing issues at hand. There's an expert in this area, there's an expert in this area, and we have to try to weigh not only what the experts are saying, but the people's freedom at the same time and the laws of our land. We have to weigh all that together. That's what a policymaker is there for. And for them to just say, this is what the experts are saying, it's just an abdication of that responsibility. They're choosing not to be a policymaker at that point. They've become just they're miming whatever somebody else said. And then when you get mad at them, you can't get mad at them because they say, well, go somewhere else. I'm just doing what they told me to do.
Yeah. And it's part of that, again, is survival because of where we're at as a people, because we demand that they fix everything. And I think all the legislative reps knew they couldn't fix everything. It was shifted to the governor and the mayors because they have more insulation in the political process. There's a lot more people to vote for them. And typically incumbents are voted in. We even saw that in California with Governor Newsom. Produced a lot of ire with his policies that were very strict COVID policies. And there was a recall election, and California still didn't kick him out during that time. But on a more local level, if you have representatives, far smaller groups of people, they were more likely to lose elections. And so part of that was the political process playing out, letting those that were a little more insulated and could take a little more heat, they let them take the heat. And the legislatures were kind of willing to let some of that power be taken over by the executive branch. And a number of the executive branches were very happy to take it. We saw very competing responses in a number of states. You look at Governor Newsom in California, Governor DeSantis in Florida. Very different. And now again, those states I think are attracting different people even now as a result, post-COVID. People either leaving or going. And so come 2030, it will be quite fascinating to see the difference in America's political makeup and how that works. But overall, I look at where we're at, and we had a scenario of intense power asserted upon the American people. And again, you can view that as right, you can view that as wrong. That doesn't necessarily matter for the sake of this discussion. Intense power, intense law that comes down and cracks down on a very personal level. Here in Utah, we were told you couldn't even be in a house with 10 or more people. So this is now impacting families. I have 8 children. And so that meant a grandparent couldn't even visit if we were to follow that. And so at an individual level, we started having people start to rebel. Started to say, well, I'm going to put a check on the government myself. They stopped wearing masks. They'd go into stores. Some would get angry. There were a few shootings, I believe, over being asked to wear a mask or different things. I'm not necessarily justifying any of those, just describing that people started feeling the need to start to check some of these policies, and to the point where they felt justified with violence. And at the same time, we had riots over police force and different things. And it was interesting to see an intense frustration over use of police force occur at the same time as this intense kind of lockdown on America. Because I think most America felt the heavy hand of government. And then that being coupled with racial targeting or different things that took place with some of these police forces sent kind of a spark and a shockwave through a lot of communities. We saw riots, we saw different things. And I think it's important to look at all that and to say, when the balance is off, what do we see? And when the balance is there, what do we see? And to understand part of America, part of the thing that made America and that the founders believed even, is that there's some principles more important than even life itself. And I don't say that to mean that it's okay just to kill people. But they were willing to go fight and die for something, for a principle that to them was worth it, was worth the sacrifice of their life. And as we look at freedom and the balance, to maintain that balance, there's no way for the government to protect everyone. You could view that as, anarchy is a very dangerous state. Tyranny, the theory with tyranny is you can control all people, you can control situations, you can make it a safe place to live. But there's no way for law to achieve pure safety. There's no way for law to fully shut down humans unless you make them slaves, unless you control all their actions. And so to me, it's important to understand that when we talk about liberty, when we talk about a balance, we are talking about scenarios where somebody will still die unjustly. There will still be bad things that happen. And then we have to step back and look, is America progressively getting better? Are these issues becoming fewer and fewer? Or are we getting worse and worse? Is the system breaking down? Is it not working? And a lot of that comes back to this personal responsibility to say, are we taking responsibility for our own lives and own actions? If we slip and fall on the floor, is it always the store's fault? Or do we ever take responsibility and say, I was the one that slipped and fell? That's on me. Those may seem like little things, but they're actually big because they translate into how we talk to politicians, which translates directly into how they respond to things. When we talk about the fear of being sued, and that driving so many of the decisions of what happened during COVID, we have to understand that the way we talk to people radically influences how they respond to situations like this. And when we blame others for things that are possibly our own and we shift responsibility to them, it has an impact. And I think we saw a lot of that play out full scale with COVID, where one of the most major things that I believe led to the incredible throw off of balance in America. I personally believe that the balance of liberty was very thrown off during that time. But I think the biggest contributing factor to it was that Americans blamed everyone else. And it wasn't a personal thing. And so in that scenario, it was intense fear. Every school district, I don't want to be blamed. Every mayor, I don't want to be blamed. Every legislative rep, I don't want to be blamed. And everyone was passing the buck, pointing fingers, doing things. And I think it led to a lot of frustration in America. But very rarely in America did we ever look at ourselves and say, how am I contributing to this? Am I taking appropriate responsibility for myself? Am I taking appropriate responsibility for my life, even if you think outside COVID? Or do I blame others? Do I want the government to fix things? Everything. And that discussion, I think, is very important to have, because ultimately, as American people, we are the biggest check on the government. There are checks and balances between systems. The legislature can check the governor can check the legislature, the courts step in at times and check things as well. Some cities chose to not follow certain policies or recommendations. They wouldn't enforce them with their police force. Some were intense on it, arresting people, doing different things. But each city, each thing played out. And ultimately, we're still working to, I think, come to a place of understanding on that. But we're reaching a point where I think if we had another pandemic, things would look very different. School responses would look incredibly different. A lot would change. But those things can only change if we as a people change as well in how we look at those things. So to me, COVID is a great study, great case to look at American systems in general, to say, wow, all these things played out, thousands of different groups making decisions, seeing good or bad. Did more people die in Florida than California? Did more people die in certain states than other states? Was it better off in America than in Italy? Was it worse off? Different things. And there's all kinds of numbers. Trying to get those numbers and that information is difficult. I know people accuse China of fabricating information all the time. I don't have any idea. I don't have a way to test that necessarily. But I think that is one of the things that as a whole we get through in America, and we have to take a step back and look at the big picture. What are we going for in life? And where are our values at?
And I think that's the important point. Is our goal in America to have the best possible outcome in COVID? And maybe it is, but I think our goal is a little bit higher than that. I think America was formulated to provide liberty to the society that we're in, and that through that liberty, individuals could create something more powerful than was being created before. And so sometimes we look at the outcome of a decision to determine whether the decision was right or not. But I think we need to start looking at the decisions and just say, in principle, is this decision accurate? Meaning, if I make a good choice, my choice is good, whether or not the outcome is considered desirable or not. If I am kind to another individual and they yell at me, was my decision a poor one? No, my decision was good. It's not based on the outcome. And I think it will help us in the choices we make as far as legislation, as far as our behavior as citizens. If we can say, what are the principles we're basing our choices on, rather than outcomes obviously can play some informative roles. But ultimately, what is the principle I'm basing my decision on so that I can know if this is the proper decision for me, my family, for my country? If we can base it on a principle, then I think we can come together on decisions more than if we're just basing it strictly on output, what happens because of a decision.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would submit that one reason we struggle so much in America right now is because many Americans don't have a consistent set of principles that they're aiming for. And so some news story will sound bad, a fraud or a shooting or COVID or whatever it is. And we want to correct the wrong. And I think that's a natural human desire, and that's a innate good desire to say, I don't want bad things happening. But then to really evaluate those within a set of principles to say, but if I do this today, what does it lead to? And where does it take us? And in America, if we go to a place of safety, we say we want to produce zero harm. We want to do no harm. We want to make sure no one's ever killed or unjustly hurt. To then question, well, where does that lead us? What type of scenario does that produce? Because do you really want that lifestyle? Because it would likely impact prosperity. It would likely impact the freedoms you have. Do you truly appreciate the freedoms you have? The fact that you can go to the movies when you want to, the fact that you can go drive anywhere when you want to. If we had to stop all harm, for example, on the roads, we would have incredible restrictions on who could travel, when they could travel, all those types of things. And you would not be free just to go to the movies when you want. And I think that we live in so much luxury that we've forgotten what gives us that luxury. We've forgotten that there are things that enable prosperity and success. And so it is very important to look at the principles to say, I think it's very helpful to look at the outcomes and say, hey, did America do better or worse, number-wise? But then to say, but overall, is America doing better or worse? Are we at a place where people would still rather live here, even with the risk of COVID infections, if that's the case? Or would people just self-select and choose to live in other countries that were supposedly safer? I think China is making a case that they're one of the safest countries to live in with COVID. They'll lock you down and keep you locked down. And how many people in America are jumping to China? How many want that system that exists there, and why is that? And I think that goes to the deeper fundamental question. And that's one of the things we're trying to talk about here in A Case for America is start to look at our roots, start to look at what it is that makes America so amazing. And it is a balance. It's not purely outcome driven. We've had some bad outcomes in America, there's no doubt. And people will look at those and criticize America for it. But when you look at things as a whole, I think America is still an amazing place to be. And I suggest that when we work to maintain the balance, regardless of the outcome, we're going to be happier, we're going to be better off as a whole than if we sacrifice those for a short-term outcome that will lead to long-term loss of freedom or liberty. But we certainly have talked for a little while today. We appreciate you being with us. And we hope that you take this time to think a little bit about your life. How much do you say the law should have stopped that? Government should have stopped that. Someone should have done something. And how often do you say, I should have done something. There's something else I could have done. and start to think about your actions and how they impact America, because America ultimately is just the conglomerate of all of us individuals and the things that we think and say and do. And those do have impacts on what takes place. So we will touch base again next week. And again, we appreciate you. And we will have more discussions then about America and Case for America.